Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the third of our service design webinars. Today we'll be exploring user testing. We'll be looking at how it can benefit your organisation and most importantly, how it can benefit your users. I'm Jonathan Pugh. I'm Digital Marketing and UX Consultant here at Hyphenate. I joined the team after spending 6 years in the non-profit sector in different digital marketing roles. And now my main focus is on design and improving user experiences on the services and products that we offer. We have Jodie, Kirsten and Anne with us today for the webinar, and they'll be introducing themselves now. Jodie, do you want to go first?
Hi everyone, I'm Jodie Stanley. I'm a service designer at Hyphenate. And I've worked in the charity sector for around 8 years now in various roles, including service design and user research. Most recently, I was a senior user researcher at Citizens Advice. So hopefully that will help me to give you some tips today around user testing.
Fantastic. And Kirsten?
Hi there, I'm Kirsten Reed. And I'm a service designer at Hyphenate. I've been here for about 4 months and I spend a lot of time with our clients working on improving their forms and processes and looking at how we can get user feedback. Prior to that, I worked at the National Lottery Community Fund for about 15 years in a funding capacity and then subsequently in funding development, business improvement and service design. So I've got quite a lot of experience in this area.
Fantastic. And finally, Ange?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Angela Murray. I'm Head of Strategy and Impact at Hyphenate. So I work with Johnny, Kirsten and Jodie on service design. So as I've described, helping people to improve their user experience and their forms and processes. And then I also work with our management team on our sales strategy. Prior to joining Hyphenate, I've worked for a number of different charities, including Comic Relief and the National Lottery Community Fund. So I've got various experience in testing in different scenarios.
Excellent, thank you very much. So let me just share the screen. Going back to our presentation, everyone. So yeah, as you all know, this is the basics of user testing. Throughout the webinar, we'd like to encourage everyone to ask as many questions as they wish. You can do so by clicking on the orange button in the bottom left-hand side of your screens. Okay, so today is all about user testing. User testing is such a valuable research method as it allows you to understand our users and how they interact with the services that we offer. Understanding how your audience use your product or service can tell you a lot more than just the traditional research methods. After all, they are the ones that will ultimately be using it. So why do user testing? So user testing is a great way to understand not just what people will say or think about the product, but actually how they use it and interact with it. It's important to remember that what your users say and what your users do are actually quite different. And the best way to know what they do is to be watching them for yourselves. So user testing involves getting potential users of your product or service to test run for a fresh perspective. So key reasons to test include getting an unbiased information from them. So it's a great way to get unbiased information about how your product is working, including where your users are getting stuck or frustrated. To validate or challenge assumptions. So user testing can help to validate or challenge the assumptions about your products or service and show your product from the user's perspective. And finally, to minimize the need to resolve issues further down the line. So testing early and regularly can save us time and resources resolving those issues that might arise further down the line. So I'll now pass you over to Jodie, who will be talking about what to test.
Thanks, Johnny. So as consultants who regularly work with funders, we do see many opportunities to test with users. And these include testing forms. So forms take up a lot of time for many users of funding services, and it's important that they work for your users so that you can gather the data that you need from them first time round. You may also want to test your website. So your website is often the first place that your users will go to find out information about your services. And testing your website with real users will help you to know whether they are finding the information that they need and accessing the services with ease or not. You can also test just elements of your service. So with a prototype, so this could be something as simple as sharing an idea with your users for feedback or asking them to step through a part of the process. And I'm going to speak to you a little bit more about prototypes and what they are. So they're a great way to understand if your idea or product meets the needs of your users before you have to spend time and resources in fully developing up your idea. So a prototype is a tangible model of the solution you are trying to develop rather than the actual solution. And testing a prototype can help you with many things. So it can help you to communicate your ideas in a way that is understandable. So showing your ideas rather than telling people what your idea is. And it can help you to highlight issues with your idea, product or service early so that you can make amendments when you further develop it. And your prototype can be something as simple as a Word document outlining questions in any form that you're designing, or it could be a brainstorm of Post-it notes laying out your ideas, or it could just be a simple sketch that you've done, or a storyboard showing the steps that a user might take throughout your service. So next, Andy's going to speak to you about how you can test.
Great, thanks, Jodie. So in terms of how you can test, we're going to talk through the various steps. So we're going to think about how you get people involved, how you get people to be your testers, the different types of tests you can do, and then how you can analyze that data at the end. And all the way through this, it's important to say that there's no kind of right way. There's not this one perfect way that you would do it. There's lots of different ways that you can do it. And that's partly going to depend as well on how much time you've got, how much resource, and also what you're trying to achieve with your testing. So that's where we're going to start, is thinking about the objectives of the testing, because that's going to frame kind of what the testing looks like and how we do the testing. So we want to define our objectives up front. So our objectives are probably going to look quite different if we're testing something that's brand new, like a new form, a new service, a new product, versus something that might have been going for a long time and we're trying to improve. Maybe we've had some negative feedback and we want to dig into that and understand what is it that's frustrating people about our service or why they're struggling to use it. So we've got some example objectives here just to try and bring it to life a little bit. So first one, know if my users can understand the form. So we've already mentioned forms. They're something that we see a lot in the testing that we do here at Hyphenate. So testing forms is a great way to see, can people actually get from the beginning to the end without us prompting them? Where do they get stuck? Do they understand the questions? Where are the bits that maybe we could improve and make those easier? And that's a nice contained bit of testing, just trying to understand what are the good and bad bits about our form. We might have a much wider objective. So that's the second one here, knowing if users can navigate through a service without support. So thinking about whole service, maybe you run sessions in a community centre and you want to understand, how do people find those sessions? Can they book in okay? Can they find the centre? Do they feel welcomed? Do they encounter any challenges accessing those services? So you're thinking about the whole thing from beginning to end. And you might just be testing the idea of the service. You might not even have it up and running. And when we talk about the methods, we'll talk about different ways that you can test those things. We might want to test something that's like a contained bit of a service. So the next one we've got here is understanding if users can easily find the information they need. So an example that we would see fairly regularly at Hyphenate for this one would be testing a bit of a website. So maybe testing the guidance section of the funding part of your website to see, can people find the guidance that they need for a particular program? Does it make sense to them? Do they have any challenges with that? And then finally, you might have an objective just to test some assumptions that you have about your users. So this is where user testing, I think, becomes really fun. So we obviously have assumptions that we bring when we're making a form or we're designing a website, putting our content together. And when we do the testing, we get to see, do people click where we expect they're going to click? Do they understand what we think they're going to understand by that particular question? And it could be really interesting to see what comes out of that. So once we've defined our objectives, we know why we're testing. We need to decide who we're going to test with. And you can see on the slide, we've divided these into definitely don't test with this group and do test with these people. So who not to test with. So don't test with yourself, your colleagues, or the person at the desk next to you, or people in organizations like you, people who look and think like you think. So just to clarify, if I was, let's say I've developed a form for making a donation, and I want to test that, obviously before I start the testing, I am going to do some kind of just functional testing myself. I'm going to want to make sure the form works before I test it. And I might ask somebody else in the organization to have a look at it. But that's not what we mean by user testing. That's kind of the preparation for the user testing. If I was to do all the user testing just by myself or with people in my team or my organization, that's not going to give us very good feedback, because we're going to be coming to that test with a whole load of background information. We're going to know why the form's been put together, or the general things that we're trying to achieve, and how people are eligible or not eligible. And potentially we might have a higher level of IT literacy than the people testing, because we use IT all the time in our job. So we're not going to give very interesting feedback. Who we want to test with are the group there on the right-hand side. So existing users, so people who have to use this service. So people who are going to use this donation form or this website are perfect people to test with. We could also test with people who've used the service in the past. And then this third group are super interesting. So potential users, people who don't currently use the service, but who we would like to use the service in future. So one way that we see this at Hyphenate is where organizations we work with are looking at the people who access the service, and they're noticing that certain groups are less represented, or maybe not represented at all. So maybe, let's say, people from a particular geography are missing, or a particular ethnic group, or low earners are missing, or something around gender. And they're like, okay, we really want to increase that user group. And so testing with those people will help you understand what are the barriers, why are they not currently accessing the service, and what can you do to make that service work better for them in future. So we've got our objectives, we've decided who's going to be testing. Now we have to find these people, which is obviously a bit of a challenge. And I guess it's important to think about the number of people first that we want to find, and then going to go about finding them. Obviously, the more people that we test with, the more data we're going to have. And Kirsten's going to talk later about how we might analyze that and look at what that's going to tell us. But obviously, we're also restricted by the amount of time we have available and the amount of resource we have. So we would recommend aiming for at least 5 testers if you can. So you don't need to do loads and loads of testing. Just getting 5 people will actually give you a lot of really key feedback. And if you've got significant problems with areas of your service, they're bound to come out if you're testing just with those 5 people. So aim for that. And if you can do more, then brilliant. In terms of finding them, so the most obvious and easy way to find people is using your own data set. So most organizations have got a mailing list, some kind of database, and that's going to be a really easy way. We've made a note here, though, just to check that you do have permission to contact them before you get excited and start contacting them for testing. But assuming you have permission, then that's a great place to start. The second group we've mentioned here is organizations who have access to your target group. And this is particularly useful for that third group we talked about, where they don't currently access your service. So these are people that don't know about you, you don't know about them, and you want to know about them. So if you've got particular demographics, particular types of people in mind, you can talk to organizations that you know who work with those people and explain what testing you want to do and see if they can help you access some people to test. We also recommend the community and voluntary services, who do a lot of work with charities and organisations to help people apply for funding, have loads of experience in testing forms, so they can give you feedback, and they can also get you access to people who can test for you. You can also, if you have a website, just do a call out through your website, looking for testers, and see who responds to that. And then social media is a really quick, free, easy way to get people for testing. We've seen quite a few charities do this really well. So just sending out a tweet, posting on your organization's Facebook or LinkedIn, just saying, we're looking for people to test a form. Please, can you help us improve our website? This is your chance to get involved, and just seeing who comes forward. And that can help you get quite a nice range of people for your testing. So once you've found your testers, before you then jump into the testing, there's one more step to think about, and that's consent. So it's really important that we get consent from people before we get them to be involved in testing. That doesn't need to be really complex and burdensome. We've got an example here on the screen, so it's just super short. And you just tell people what's the purpose of the testing. So why are you asking them to do the test today? Why you need to record it if you are recording it. And Jodie's going to talk a bit about why we think recording sessions is really valuable. And then thirdly, just what you're going to do with the insights that are gathered, just so people really have a good understanding of what they're going to be doing. And then once you've got that, you're good to go and you're ready to move on to deciding your testing method. And I'm going to hand over to Jodie to talk about that.
Thanks, Ange. So once you've worked out who you're testing with, sorted out your consent, the next thing you want to do is think about what method you're going to use. You need to consider with this. So first of all, how much time do you have to test and analyze your results? Some methods take a bit more time than others, so you might only have a small bit of time and you might want to pick the less time-consuming method. You need to think about who your users are and where are they based. So do you need to access them face-to-face? Do you need to travel to them? Because that's going to take more time.
Oh, Jodie, I think we lost Jodie temporarily. Ange, Kirsten, do one of you want to jump in?
Observation.
Oh, Jodie, we just missed you temporarily. So could you start that section again, please?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Thank you.
So I think we have some technical difficulties. So the next thing you'll need to do is choose your method. So there's a few things you'll need to think about here. And the first thing you'll need to think about is how much time do you have to test and also to analyze your results. Some methods take longer than others, so you'll need to think about what your timeline is for this project. You'll also need to think about who your users are and where are they based. So will you need to factor in the time to travel to them, or will you be carrying out testing remotely? And finally, what is it that you're testing? So are you testing something online, or are you testing something that could just be a document that you might be able to do face-to-face? I'm going to take you through some methods. Not all of these are testing methods, but we've kept it simple for today. So I'm going to start with observation. Observation is a method that we use a lot at Hyphenate, and that's because it gives us really rich data. And we not only get to hear how users interact with our service, but we get to see that in real time. And it can be carried out either remotely or in person. So it's a very flexible method. So if you wanted to carry out observation remotely, you'll need a tool like Teams or Zoom, which will allow your participant to share their screen and complete a task that you give them. For example, if you're testing a form, you might ask them to complete a form and show you how they would do that. So before they begin, it's important to encourage your participants to think out loud, and that means to tell you any thoughts that come into their head as they're going through your form or website or product that you're testing. And it's important to record the sessions so that you can go back to them to fully understand the insights that you've gathered. And also, if possible, have a colleague with you to take notes, and that will allow you to really focus on your user. And remember that when you're carrying out testing and observation, it's your role to listen and observe, not to guide or give advice or explain why the product is the way that it is. And this will help to ensure that your product is being tested as authentically as possible. To carry out observation in person, the same principles apply, except you'll be doing it in the same room as your user. And it can be a good idea to attach a second screen to the testing device if you're testing something digital, so that you can see what they're doing without interfering and hovering over them. For more complex products where you might want to understand how your users are experiencing specific sections of a website, for example, you might want to find out if they can find the information about eligibility for funding. You might want to consider using scenarios for testing. And this would be conducted in the same way as observational testing, with the addition of asking your user to carry out one or more tasks in different scenarios. A couple of examples of scenarios would be: you are interested in applying for funding, but not sure whether you are eligible. Can you show me how you would find this information on the website? Or you need to find out what funding reports you need to submit and how. Can you navigate to this information? And asking follow-up questions like, how confident are you that you've now found the right information? Or how easy did you find it to get to this part of our website? Using scales like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 will help you to quantify your findings later on when you get onto analysis. which Kirsten's going to speak to you about soon. So now we're going to show you 2 videos, examples of observation testing, and you can get to see our brilliant acting skills in this too. One of the videos is going to show best practice in observation, and one is going to show you not so good practice. So we'll take a look at them and hopefully you find them interesting. I don't think we can hear the sound, Johnny. I'm not sure if it's playing.
Okay, we might have another technical issue. We might just have to miss out the demos, but we can follow these up when we send the video out to everyone after. Apologies about that.
No problem. Thanks, Johnny.
Okay.
You'll be able to view that when we share the webinar link with you afterwards. So apologies. But that's okay. We'll skip to the next section. So I want to speak to you about unmoderated testing. So this is testing, user testing without support. So they'll do this away from you in a place that you don't know about. And this can be very useful for when you want to test with a large number of users that you wouldn't be able to access because of time constraints or because they're far away. And also it's good when you want to get a lot of insight in a short amount of time. It can also help you to get some more unbiased views of users, as they won't feel the effect of being watched, which is a small risk of the observation testing. So how do we do this? It's similar to observation testing. You need to have your thing, whatever it is, ready to test, along with a design of a short survey to address your testing objectives. And the survey can be something fancy in SurveyMonkey, or it could simply be some questions that you're sending an email. So you'll need to share a link to the thing that you're testing, or an image or a document to your users along with the survey, and ask them to spend some time using that prototype and answering the questions. And then you'll then get your responses back, and you'll be able to quantify them and understand how your product is performing for them. So it's a great way to get lots and lots of feedback in a short space of time without having to travel, and also getting more authentic views of users because they're not going to have you supporting them or watching what they're doing. So the last method I want to speak to you about today is A/B testing. And this is slightly different to other methods, as it involves testing 2 versions of your product, website or form. And it's a method that's most useful when you're designing something new and you're not sure which option is the most effective. So you may have the resources to develop 2 actual web pages to test before they're fully designed. But even if you don't, you can get some useful insights just from testing the idea. So how do we do this? The first thing you'll need to do is have 2 variations ready to test. So this could be 2 versions of your web page, or even just 2 images or pieces of text if you are in the early stages of your design. You need to get some questions ready to ask your users. So they might be something like, what do you like about this design? What would you change about it? How useful did you find it? And it's important to keep the questions the same for each version that you're testing, so that you can compare results and understand which performed best in the test. And your participants should be randomly allocated a single version each, and that's to keep your test fair. So for all methods, it's really vital that you're able to take notes, and so that you're able to focus your attention. So that you're able to focus your attention as a moderator. Do encourage your colleagues to get involved and take notes for you, and that will allow you to just focus on your user and make sure that you're observing as best as you can. And there's many other methods that you can use for testing, but we're going to keep it simple for today. So I'd recommend doing some research if you're interested in other ways of testing. I'm going to pass over to Kirsten now, who's going to speak to you about how you can analyse your testing results.
Hi, everyone. Let's have a little chat about analysis. So as Jodie was just mentioning, it's really good if you can get someone else to take notes for you when you're doing your testing, because the key to analysis is good note taking. If you've got clearly written notes that make sense, you have all the ingredients to produce the insights you need that will tell you a lot about how your product is performing. Here's some simple steps to help you analyse your data. So firstly, put your notes out in front of you so that they're all visible on one document or one screen. And then you want to try and highlight insights that are similar between all your users. So you might want to create your own categories. For example, the categories could be based on something like common user behaviour that you've observed. So users might not have had enough information, or users were stuck at a particular point. Or your categories could be based on something like the issue that the user raised. So for example, that might be a page order on a form, or question content, or something like that. Where you find that more than one participant has similar issues with your product, highlight the issue and then keep account of how many people mentioned it. So by doing this, you should be able to start seeing some trends in your data that you can turn into recommendations. We find sometimes a user will raise an issue that will be something so obvious you'll be amazed you didn't notice it yourself. And it's even better if more than one person's noticed that. So I'm just going to show you a bit of an example of a spreadsheet that we've used to do some analysis on a form. So you can see that we've got the page number of the form. We've also got a column showing comments on usability that this particular user made, comments on content of the questions, and then any other feedback that they mentioned. And this is something that we will have filled in as we were going along. I don't know if you can see, but along the bottom of this spreadsheet, we've got different tabs. So there's user 1, user 2, user 3, and user 4. So we're completing that for each user. And then we've got subsequent tabs for recommendations and other bits of feedback. And that's a good way to start actually capturing that information so you can analyse it. We're now just going to talk about how you prioritise those bits of information, because obviously you're going to get quite a lot back. You can see there's a lot of comments just from one single user. So when prioritising, it's good to remember that you want your product to work for the majority of users. It's never going to be possible to satisfy 100% of people. So you need to prioritise the actions that will address the issues that arose most in your testing sessions. What happens if you prioritise issues that were only experienced by one user? You might actually find that you're causing issues for the majority. For example, there might be one user who wanted to be able to view the location of services that you offer on your website by categorising it by local authority, whereas actually the majority might have found viewing locations by town more useful. So if you change the view to local authority, you're then causing frustration with the majority. But if you try to do both, you're going to complicate the user journey. So you sort of need to decide which of those is the priority, and often it's going with the majority. Prioritisation, you might also need to take into account what's feasible when considering your resources to address the user issues. So it can be a good idea to start off with some quick wins that you know are going to add value, and then keep a note of the actions that would involve more costs and effort later on. This can also be relevant when perhaps it involves you as an organisation making a bit of a decision about something that you need to sort of pick up and have a conversation with various different stakeholders. You might not be able to do that in the short term, but you might want to sort of make a note and have a look at that in the longer term to action at a later date. Another way to prioritise is to use a bit of a scoring system. So we've got another spreadsheet that we can show you where we have actually prioritised the recommendations. So here is an example of where we've got a list of themes or categories on the column on the left. You can see things like we've identified things like flow and page order, usability, content. And then we've got a recommendation that's come out of what we've analysed. We've got the supporting comments from different users in the following column that actually where their recommendation came from, and then a column with priorities in. In this case, we've just used a really simple 1 to 3 scale, 1 being the highest priority and 3 being lowest. The reason we've done that here is because number 1 was a priority for where more than 2 users mentioned the issue. Number 2 was for where it was 2 users, and number 1 was for it was number 3 was for it was only 1 user mentioning it. So that's one simple way of prioritising. You can also use other scales, like there's something called the Moscow scale, which is must have, should have, could have and won't have. So you can decide what are the features you really absolutely have to have, or issues that people have raised that without that they wouldn't be able to, it wouldn't be usable. Should have is things that you really ought to do if you've got the time to do it. Could have is more sort of nice to haves. And then won't have is things that you've agreed is not a priority or isn't practical for you to enact. So once you've done your prioritisation, you need to think about sharing your findings. And depending on your role within your organisation and what you're testing, you probably need to share your findings to get buy-in for the changes or new features you're recommending as a result of that user testing. User testing can be very powerful, so we like to emphasise the importance of showing, not just telling stakeholders about your users' needs that you've uncovered through the testing. There's a few ways you can do this. One of them might be sharing some of the recordings that you've got of users testing your product, with their consent, of course. That's really useful. You can also share real quotes from your users more widely. This is one that I've done before. I've actually got stakeholders actively involved in user testing, so got them to actually make some notes when we're observing our users doing the testing. And that can be really sort of eye-opening, I think, for people who can be quite wedded to certain ideas or certain ways of doing things, to see users interacting with them and perhaps finding it's not the best way. And finally, a little bit of a segue into our next webinar. You can also create a user journey map, which is a great way to illustrate your users' experiences and each step that they go through and the ups and downs that they experience. You can create these maps visually and then pin them on the wall if you're actually in an office. Or if you're not, you can make them into a poster and share them electronically. However you choose to share your findings, the key message you need to get across is that the experience of your users is vital in the design of your service or product. They're the ones who are using it after all, and you need them to be able to do that successfully to save you time in going back and forwards with them and to make the experience for them better, to get better results for everybody, really. It should be at the centre of your service design. Finally, we're just going to talk about when to test. So we mentioned this earlier, but test early and often. Testing early means that if you test your product or service before it's been fully designed and implemented, you're going to be able to get the most valuable feedback to stop you spending loads of money and time on creating something that's not going to work for your users. We talked earlier about creating a prototype. You can do this by simply sharing a document with your draft questions for a form, or you could create a storyboard or a map of what your application process might look like if that's what you're trying to test. Once you've gathered these insights and used them to improve your design, test again. That way you know your final product is going to meet the needs of your users before launching. So make sure you iron out those last pain points. It doesn't stop there either. We live in a fast-changing world and our users don't stay the same for very long. Their needs might change. So testing your product at regular intervals can ensure that your service doesn't fall behind and it's keeping up with the changing needs of your users. The most important thing to remember is your user testing doesn't need to be fancy. You can keep costs down and still gather the insights from your users that could potentially mean the difference between them using your product or not. So with that in mind, I'll pass you back on to Jodie for a quick sum up.
Thanks, Kirsten. So that brings us to the end of our tips on user testing. Let's do a quick recap on testing with users. So the first thing we spoke about was defining your objectives. So think about what do you want to find out and why do you need to test. Secondly, decide who to test with. And remember that testing with yourselves or your colleagues is not user testing. Thirdly, find your users. There's different channels that you can go through, which we mentioned earlier in the webinar. The fourth point was consent. So make sure you have permission to record and use the insights of your users. 5, choose your method. So we spoke to you about observation, unmoderated testing, and A/B testing. And again, there are other methods out there. So you do contact us after if you're interested in finding out more, or do some research online, and there's lots of information out there. The next thing you'll need to do is analyze. So look for some trends in your data, then prioritize those actions and recommendations. And finally, share your findings because you're going to need some buy-in from your stakeholders to make those changes that you're recommending. So that's all we had today on user testing. We'll open up to Q&A now. Please post any questions that you have if you haven't had a chance already using the speech bubble in your screen. And we'll just wait for those questions to come through. I'm sure there's some coming. Oh, here we go. So what happens if your user doesn't have Teams or Zoom? Kirsten, I'm going to pick on you for that one. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we're talking about technology that people may or may not have access to. So if it's not appropriate to test with them online and you're dealing in particular with users who really struggle to get online, it might be that sometimes online products or tools aren't the best thing for them anyway. So that's where you might consider testing in person and trying to find somewhere to meet and talk to them in person, go through something that could be paper-based, or sit with them on a computer. If they find that sort of thing difficult, you know that that's one of the users that's going to find that kind of thing challenging. So yeah, we'd recommend looking at other methods if that's the case.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. Any more questions coming through, Johnny? Oh, great. So what if I can't find the right users to test with? And do you want to give that a go?
Yeah, so we mentioned earlier different ways that you can find users. So if you're struggling to find users, the kind of cheapest way is to try and connect with other organizations that you think might have contact with those users. We mentioned that earlier, but that is definitely the kind of often quickest and cheapest way of doing it. Well, maybe not quickest, but definitely cheapest way of doing it. It's also a good way of networking with other organizations. But if that doesn't lead to success, then you can use recruitment agencies. So there's recruitment agencies out there that are designed to help you find people to test. One thing to bear in mind with that approach is that often there's a need, you need to pay the recruitment agency, but you often need to offer incentives as well so that people will take part in the testing. So you do need to have some budget in mind for that. But yeah, it's generally not the case that you can't find the users. It's just, do you have the budget to be able to get to the ones that you want to get to?
Yeah, and I think just from my experience, it's never been that difficult to find users. And I think hopefully the tips that we've gone through today will help you to explore different channels because they're out there. And also if you offer incentives, that might draw them in to you as well.
Cool. So a couple more questions come in.
Great. So what happens when your users need one thing, but your organization believes that another thing is best? I'm going to try and give this one a go because this is something that I've experienced probably quite a few times in my user research career. So the first thing I would say is get your colleagues and stakeholders involved in testing, as Kirsten mentioned earlier, so that they can see for themselves what their users are experiencing. Normally that's quite a powerful thing to do because rarely people see how their users are struggling with their product or service. They're not going to want to ignore that. So that's a good way to do it. Also, I think just be really strong in your recommendations and make sure you back them up with evidence. So kind of just making statements saying we think users need so-and-so isn't going to be as strong as showing a video that your user needs something because they're struggling with a system or a website. Any thoughts from anyone else?
I think it's really useful to understand, let's say, for example, some staff in an organization disagree with the user findings for whatever reason. Like an example that I've come across is where in a funding context, users are saying, well, we want to be able to report in our own format because we create monitoring reports for other funders and we just want to send you that. We don't want to fill in the form. And then the staff in the organization were less keen on that because it was going to lead to a lot more work for them. So actually the root issue there is potentially how many staff you have per number of grants and how much time they have. And actually maybe it becomes more of an organizational design question. Can we resource this? It's not necessarily that they disagree, but it's because they disagree with the current organizational model. Because sometimes testing is just like, I'm changing some word in this question. And sometimes testing leads you to go, actually, we need to rethink our model. and how many people we have involved. So I think it's important to be able to try and step back and look at what the root causes of the disagreement might be.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, another question. So what do you do if users are giving contrasting feedback? Kirsten, you spoke a little bit about analysis and prioritization, so I thought you might.
Yeah, well, I mean, to start with, it's probably the principle that we mentioned, that if you've got, you go with the majority, if that's the case. But if, say, you've got 2 users versus 2 users, both giving contrasting feedback, similar, or and you don't know which to go with, it might be a good idea to try and do some A/B testing. That's where we were talking about the comparative testing. And if you've got, for example, a question that 2 users are finding really easy and really like, and 2 users are suggesting quite a fundamental change to because it's too difficult, then test 2 different versions and maybe test it with other users as well to see which one comes out on top and which one elicits the best response. And so that's probably what I'd do.
Yeah, I think also test more, because maybe you haven't tested with enough users as well if you're getting 50-50 and if they are contrasting views. Or it might be that you're testing with 2 different groups and actually their needs are different and they need 2 different things. Yeah, it's a good question.
That's all the questions.
Okay, brilliant. So I suppose that's us for the day. So thank you for taking the time to join today's webinar. We really hope that you found it useful. If you have any questions about user testing or anything else service design related, please do contact us at design@-8.com. And in our next webinar, as Kirsten mentioned earlier, we'll be looking at user journey mapping, so talking you through the steps of how you could do that yourselves. So thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.